I had been unable to leave the telephone and my desk until late in the evening because several units were scheduled to leave for the battlefront that night. Words to describe our reunion fail me even now. I still see today the little fellow deeply asleep in his pram beside the bed. He was solid, dark-haired, and looked like a little Italian. I couldn't take my eyes off him. Between 4 and 5 a.m. next morning, Patricia and I walked through the darkened streets to the Bishop's Palace, where I had been ordered to report. I had packed my few odds and ends and said goodbye to Major Arnold, who remained behind to wrap up. I shall never forget those last few minutes with Patricia before she left to return to Wangeritz. They were marked by 2 or 3 flickering stars poking through a break in clouds. Weeks later, perhaps it was on the other side of the River Oder, someone told me what had happened to Major Arnold. With the Russians drawing near, he had saddled his trusty horse and had set off towards the west. Whether he had been overtaken by Russian tanks or his beloved grey mare had slipped and broken a leg on the icy surface, or he had become so overcome by depression, I never did find out, except I heard he had first shot his horse and then himself. The 192 Reserve Division had been established in a sector along the River Wartha, somewhere between the river bend southeast of the town of Wielun and Osiakov. It was an unusually large area, which we hoped to quickly fill with retreating elements of other divisions. Our HQ was to be in the town of Wielun, and upon entering the town, we were surprised to come upon a busy weekly farmers' market and crowds of people in fur coats and hats, and numerous pony and carts. At the divisional command post, I was soon overwhelmed by the sheer volume of work which involved finding out if our neighbouring units, mostly Volkssturm, were in place and making contact with their commanders, and then setting up a tactical reserve. On the 16th, all was quiet, but on the 17th we had our first enemy contact. During the day, Russian units attempted to cross the river at Osiakov, but were driven back. Contact with other friendly units was by this time accomplished by the simple use of the public telephone system, and the Chief of Staff in Posen called up frequently to find out what the situation was. I don't remember his name, but I do know that blame for the eventual Russian breakthrough was laid at his door, because presumably on orders from Himmler, who was at the time in command of the Weichsel front line, an SS officer appeared at his headquarters who strongly suggested he should go outside and shoot himself. Our command post must have been a former Nazi party house because despite desperate conditions outside, we found an excellent kitchen and a plentiful food supply, because in the evening of the 17th, I was pleasantly surprised to be handed a generously portioned hot meal. On the morning of the 18th, enemy pressure mounted, and the River Wartha was crossed over in several places. While desperately trying to organise our town defence positions on that dull, cold, grey morning, I was surprised to find many a house still in ruins from the days of the Polish campaign in 1939. By midday, I found it necessary to telephone the artillery battery set up at the edge of town with orders to move in closer, only to have the phone answered by a female voice which declared flatly how the battery had already pulled out. This proved to be one of many examples of unauthorized retreats by burned-out, panicked and ex-horsted frontline troops. Now all that remained were the youngsters of Gnesen in the cellars on both sides of the main street, with their hand-held Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. In the late afternoon the phone rang, and a girl's voice from a local post office calmly described how in her village tanks were swiftly passing through, and she was certain they were not German. Then the line went dead. It was true the Russians had learned to thrust their armoured formation forward with brazen disregard for their flanks, just as we had done between 1940 and 1942. Shortly after dark, all hell broke loose, and from outside came the roar of engines. Walls and windows shook before I heard the first successful Panzerfaust detonations, which was followed by tank shells striking the wall of our building, forcing us to seek shelter in the cellar. On the way down through the dust-filled stairwell, I couldn't help noticing a flower-framed picture of Adolf Hitler on the wall from which a pair of large, dark, expressionless eyes stared out at us. A tank had been shot up right in front of our house, but its crew were nowhere to be seen. Had they perished or bailed out and run off in the dark? Only a youthful voice begged for mercy. Pan, pan, pan. That was followed by a single pistol shot in the gloom of the courtyard, and then all was quiet. My indignation at what I thought was the sound of a prisoner being shot evaporated immediately upon the appearance of grey, emaciated figures who had fought their way back from the Weichsel and had seen first-hand the bestial rape of girls and women and the nailing of men to barn doors. It was small wonder that upon seeing such brutality, all former proper military traditions for the handling of prisoners were ignored. There began a confusing battle in the streets where I could hardly separate friend from foe. The general decided it was time to leave town, and the necessary orders were hastily issued. The divisional staff had been separated from its vehicles, so we set off in small groups on foot, gingerly moving from one house corner to the next, until a salvo of machine-gun fire scattered us in all directions. Hugging the walls of the last house on the road leading out of Wilun, I came face to face with 3 huge Russian tanks, the noise of which had likely been drowned out by machine-gun fire. At the same time, I noticed through an open window the swaying of a naked light bulb, and it occurred to me that the tanks were lost and in need of a guide. Who would it be, a man or a woman? If German, once the tanks had found their way, a lifeless body would be tossed from the vehicle. If a Pole, he or she might just escape with their life. Just then the huge vehicles roared to life and drove off at speed towards the north. I stumbled into Captain Bibelja, the 50-year-old headmaster from Rostock, and, despite searching, we failed to find any of the others, so we decided to make our own way west in the hopes of meeting up somewhere with the rest of the divisional staff. Because we believed Russian tanks were on the road up ahead, we at first turned north and traversed snow-covered ploughed fields, before resuming our march along the main road to Werushof and the old German border. We walked and walked without meeting anyone, and the only sign of life was a solitary cat beside the road. Having had no sleep over 3 days of high stress, we both decided to stop for a brief rest. Our astonishment was hard to describe when coming upon a house to find a woman working over a hot stove and a few other retreating soldiers seated around a table bearing a single candle. No sooner had we begged for a few minutes in which to rest, when the woman, in a completely calm and matter-of-fact manner, stood up and took a pot of hot milk from the stove and poured us each a cup. She must have seen the immense gratitude in our tired faces. I can't remember what language she spoke, but when Bibelja and I resumed our march, I had a powerful sense that there was woman who had consciously accepted her imminent death, and was in the meantime acting and behaving as if the world were at peace. A few miles on, we came upon a road that led dead straight towards the north, and we decided to follow it in the hope of meeting up with the remainder of the divisional staff. Some weeks later, after we had actually rejoined the general and his staff, we learned that they had indeed followed the same route. By now it was getting light, and the sun rose with a dazzlingly colourful light show surrounded by small puffy clouds. It was about this time, something I now know, when my cousin Sigi Walter and her 3 small sons left their estate in a horse and cart. Her husband, Piers Walter, was at the front. In a large opening in the forest, we came upon a young woodcutter, and not far away the forester's house. We approached it with caution, but were immediately taken into the warm kitchen by the Polish forester's family, and were handed a cup of warm milk. They spoke only broken German, but I was able to convince the husband to give us a lift to Kempen, some 20 kilometres distant. The good man harnessed his pony to the cart, and we were off. From a distance we could already see a long string of refugee carts and drivers, urging their exhausted horses to one side to avoid being run over by motorized traffic which were, we guessed, enemy tanks. In the cover of the trees, I let our forester turn around and return home. We had little to give him in the way of thanks. Not even the money we handed him would be of any value. I hoped that he and his family survived the Polish Holocaust. Utterly worn out, we finally covered the last 40 kilometres to the town of Kempen, where a colonel, whose name I don't remember, was in the process of organising a new line of defence and who gladly took me on as adjutant. Captain Bibelja, whose exhaustion was clearly visible, was ordered to return to the reserve battalion in Rostock. Now my job began all over again, laying out a line of defence, reorganising retreating units, feeding them, supplying them with weapons and ammunition, and inserting them into existing formations, all of which had to be accomplished in great haste and with much improvisation. The Russians left us undisturbed on the 19th of January, and by the end of the day, thanks to the public telephone network, we had a rough idea of the situation. Between enemy tanks' spearheads, a number of retreating units had fought their through from the Wartha River defence position to the west, including the battle group Gnesen. All the while, a stream of desperately fleeing refugees made road movement almost impossible. And even on the 20th, when I ventured out to the edge of town to see for myself, there were still wagons coming hell-bent out of woods. That same afternoon, I had an encounter with a National Socialist political officer of the kind I had up until then only heard of. He was, as far I can recall, a young first lieutenant who within earshot of the men attempted to override my authority and order a counterattack in order to establish a defence line further to the east. What with? With companies of old men and young boys carrying only light infantry weapons, no artillery, no tanks. He was clearly not sufficiently schooled in Nazi Party ideology and/or lacked sufficient experience to realise the sheer madness of his demands. He soon disappeared, and we never saw him again. On the morning of the 21st, there was renewed machine gun fire followed by incoming tank shells. Although we were able to hold off the enemy all day, by evening we were ordered to move back to the next stopping line east of Gross-Wartenburg. In the early hours, in a small room at the entrance to Castle Wartenburg, I fell into a leaden sleep only to be immediately awoken by the butler who had with him an exhausted young NCO who was leader of a tank-killer commando formed in a last desperate attempt to fight off the unnerving enemy tank spearheads. Scattered groups of boys and men, either on bicycles or in Volkswagens, would remain behind enemy lines under the cover of darkness and attack enemy tanks with their Panzerfausts. No historian has, as far as I know, yet written of their courage and sacrifice. The young NCO reported the presence of a nearby German tank unit before silently disappearing into the darkness. My memories of the next few days centred on Gross-Wartenburg Castle and the little town. A few kilometres to the east lay our latest assembly area situated along a newly dug network of ditches and trenches, where we felt ourselves to be a little more secure than in previous positions. Colonel X, whose name I have forgotten, established his command post in the castle in a number of pretty children rooms, which up until then had remained completely untouched, and spoke of a peaceful, happy childhood. Within half an hour, however, that image was gone, and everything had been turned upside down. The windows pointed towards the front, and it wasn't long before a tank shell struck the castle wall, sending glass in all directions and causing the heavy curtains to flutter. Outside, the destruction had just begun. Further memory scraps included a picture of the church which had been used as a refugee resting place with its straw and horse-dung covered floor, a Volkssturm unit marching through, and an old man in the middle of the ranks struck by a shell splinter silently sinking to ground, and finally at the western end of town, the impressive sight of a textbook-sighted gun emplacement manned by members of the Volkssturm, who continued to work on their defences, as if expecting to be there for months to come. Sometime during the afternoon, I was summoned to a wing of the castle reserved for its owners, where an old lady, who I think might have been the man Agerus, handed me an airman's ceremonial dagger. It was an item that had once belonged to the son of the estate who had been killed in action, and she didn't want it to fall into the hands of the Russians. Regrettably, through the turmoil of the next few days, I found it impossible to keep the dagger. Around midnight, word came that there had been yet another enemy tank penetration of our prepared defence line, and I feared that we would once again become engaged in a nighttime street battle. Fortunately, it turned out to be a case of a solitary Russian tank, having got bogged down in a small wood 100 metres to the rear of our trench, and was unable to go any further. To be nearer to our defence positions while catching a couple hours of sleep, I found a bed in an abandoned building near the edge of town. However, in the grey dawn, a messenger awoke me with the report that all battle groups were ordered to move back. I shot out of bed, we all slept in our clothes with weapons close at hand, and rushed over to the command post. There I encountered the disturbing picture of our infantry leaving their carefully prepared trenches and moving back over a snow-covered hillside. From the Russian side all was quiet, so, summoning all available assistance and issuing unmistakably clear counter-orders, we succeeded in getting the individual battle groups to halt and dig in, although where they now stood was in an open field. Even the commanders of the Volkssturm had been shocked at receiving the order to retreat and, upon further investigation, It turned out that German officers had suddenly appeared, including a major who pretended to know some of the NCOs, and, just as it was getting light, they strode the full length of the trench and adroitly persuaded our men to clear the area. Now the purpose of that solitary Russian tank became clear. It had no doubt transported German officers behind our lines who were presumably members of the National Committee of German Officers, a group formed under Russian auspices by anti-Hitler men from among prisoners captured at Stalingrad. Another grey, overcast winter day followed, during which we had the men make the most of their new, unprepared defence positions, and, much to our surprise and relief, the enemy failed to follow up. The reason we soon found out was that the Russians had already bypassed Gross-Wartenburg with their armoured spearhead, and we were now in the desperate situation of being attacked from both the front and the rear. That night, we got orders to move back to yet another defence position, which coincided with the arrival of the commander of our only supporting tank, who declared he was out of fuel and wanted permission to blow up his vehicle rather than leave it to the enemy. An enduring memory of the Gross-Wartenburg castle was its great hall, which had become a first aid and assembly station for the wounded. To my great relief, all the wounded were successfully evacuated, but by then the once pristine hall had become a room of filth and stench. Those with stomach wounds had relieved themselves in the relative warmth of a nearby corner. Bloodstains covered the floor and the walls, and the smell of blood and cold sweat was almost enough to take away one's breath. A few years ago, I received an inquiry from the former owner of the castle, who wanted to know what happened to the building during those last terrible days. He had heard that the SS had set fire to it, but wanted confirmation. I was unable to tell him one way or the other, because we had pulled out in total darkness. Memories of the next line of defence are spotty, except we ended that night in a row of small villages to the east of Gross-Wartenburg. The next morning was finally clear and sunny, and I am not sure how it came about, but Colonel X and I found ourselves directing units no greater in size than mere battle groups, and for several hours I found myself functioning as Chief of Staff. While Colonel X was up at the front and we in the staff offices were receiving repeated warnings of Russian tank penetrations, a general suddenly appeared and demanded an up-to-date situation report, which I duly gave him in brutal clarity. "Where is your 1A?" he demanded. 1A is the first general staff officer of a regularly staffed division. I was much too tired and worn out to care about such petty formalities, so I merely pointed to Sergeant Arnold and indicated that he was the 1A. Even under our present desperate conditions, handing a simple NCO the title of 1A was too much for the general, who, muttering strong expressions of disapproval, turned on his heels and departed, followed by his entourage. Only a few hours later, trouble was brewing to the north of us, where a strong enemy tank formation threatened the line, and all we had to throw against it was a bicycle company of Panzerfaust troops. The reports became increasingly more desperate, and, before we knew it, boy soldiers on bicycles were fleeing past our window. Now we knew we had to act fast if the Gnesen battle group on our right flank was not to be cut off. Partially by car, but mostly on foot, I spent the next few hours reconnoitring a side road through the woods due to the main highway being already under Russian fire. Enemy tanks were taking particular pleasure in shooting up any vehicle that ventured past a certain spot, so before reaching that section of the road, my driver stopped to wait and see before darting through. Having located an escape route, I handed him the evacuation order for the Gneseners along with a sketch and ordered him to drive with all haste back to the front line. I decided to stay until the Gnesen battle group arrived and personally lead it through the deep woods along the reconnoitred side road. In the late afternoon sunshine and sheltered from the wind, I waited silently, hoping that nothing would impede the withdrawal of these men. Hour after hour I waited at the edge of the wood, and all I saw were deer rushing from one cover to another to escape the sound of nearby machine gun fire. Other than that, all was quiet in the woods where, despite the surrounding human misery, the cycle of nature was unfolding afresh. Just as it was growing dark, they came, and to my pleasant surprise, instead of a weary rabble struggling along on foot, they came swiftly forward on sleds and wagons pulled by fresh horses. It was an impressive sight when compared to the Volkssturm misery and the many other worn-out and depleted units of the last few days. To me it was proof that under good leadership, even during those final days, a well-led battle group could remain a force to be reckoned with. Those belonging to the first squad pointed their automatic weapons at me until they realized I was the one waiting for them, and then they greeted me with almost childish delight. With frost-hard surfaces and moderate snow, my driver was easily able to get me back to the command post, although by now a long line of enemy tanks was making its way along the full length of the same village street I had left behind at midday. In the centre of the village square stood a now silent artillery piece, which after a few unsuccessful shots had been abandoned, and from the northern edge of the village came a steady stream of Red Army soldiers stamping their war forward. Their indifference to danger was remarkable, because their tanks would have given them little protection against snipers or a well-aimed bursts of machine gun fire. On our side, resistance was fading fast as leaderless groups of men bolted like lost sheep for the relative safety of the woods. One of our pupils had set a school building alight, which shone a bright light on this somewhat shameful exodus. I must have collapsed from exhaustion later that evening, because the only memory I have is of me on the floor with my Batman wrapping a blanket around me and thrusting a hard-tack biscuit into my mouth, the smell of which reminded me of the family's my last flight in 1918-19. I believe our retreat continued, and someone else must have taken over my duties that night. In a seemingly endless column with numerous stops, the march took us back to Oels, where a Russian tank spearhead already controlled the main crossroads. Long drawn-out darkened villages appeared before us, and I wondered at first if the inhabitants had already fled, or whether they had hunkered down hoping for the best. In fact, the people were gone, leaving behind hundreds of barking dogs, as if their pitiful howling signalling the looming catastrophe. A solitary tiger tank had partially cleared the crossroads, and in the light of a burning Russian tank, the long dark column proceeded over open country. Details of what happened on the west side of Oels escaped me, although another commander was known to have taken over the remainder of this sector, while Colonel X and his small staff, which included me, were ordered to the city of Breslau, today's Polish city of Wrocław. In Breslau we encountered a scene of indescribable misery. Until recently, the citizens had by Nazi Party decree been forbidden to leave, and now, accompanied by vehicles of every description, thousands of men and women, the latter mostly with small children, stumbled exhausted and half-frozen along the boulevard leading west. We took on as many as we were capable of, but I shall never forget the many hollow-eyed women and little children who had given up and lay frozen to death in the ditches, sometimes guarded over by a howling dog. When there was a little more room in our vehicle, the driver stopped beside a stumbling young woman with a baby in her arms. She seemed hardly to notice us, and failed to react to our invitation to climb aboard, so the driver jumped out and gently pulled her into the vehicle. The woman's face was bleach white. Her eyes were open and seemed to see, but in some terrible way they were quite empty. One look at the mummified tiny bundle she so desperately clutched at her breast caused us all to fall silent. The baby had clearly frozen to death. Once we had unloaded the refugees, we reported to a senior officer who may or may not have been the commander of Fortress Breslau. From him we learned that General Schrock and the entire staff of Reserve Division 192 had moved north towards Frankfurt on the River Oder, where they had been given a new assignment with Army Group Weichsel under the new command of Reichsführer Himmler. Colonel X and I were ordered to join him there. During the wait of a few hours in Breslau, I wrestled with the almost unbearable contrast between the horrors already witnessed and the innocent ignorance of the city folk calmly going about their business as if in peacetime. I found myself on an overcrowded train heading north with mostly women, children, and old men. The almost endless journey with its frequent halts brought us finally to Frankfurt on the Oder, where, to my surprise, a bus awaited us, and once again we were presented with an illusory image of optimism and a criminally deceitful sense of security compliments of the Gauleiter and Nazi Party functionaries. The evening street scenes reminded me of the Sudetenland before the outbreak of war, with traffic running almost as normal. In the offices of the city commander hastily set up in the red-brick Wilhelminian-era barracks, I changed out of my tattered uniform into fresh winter clothing and was rendered almost speechless when I was then invited to sit down for an evening meal in the almost festive-like atmosphere of a candle-lit dining hall. In this circle of officers there was, however, to be no relaxation, Every word spoken had to be carefully weighed, for who knew how many of those National Socialist political officers were seated among us, ready to report even the smallest remark that might be seen as defeatist. Early next morning, I was in the town of Reppen, and once again on the staff of General Schrock, and surrounded by the continued senseless destruction and slaughter of humans and animals. When looking at today's pointless rearming in West Germany, I am deeply grateful that the long-suffering horse has been entirely replaced by the soulless internal combustion engine. General Schrock was no youngster, and had already been removed from all frontline duty, so we found ourselves instead directing, organising and sometimes leading the flow of refugee treks in order to minimise their interference with our troop movement. On numerous other occasions, we had the terrible task of clearing entire villages whose local party officials had naively guaranteed their safety, and within the hour, plunged the hitherto trusting inhabitants into the bitter reality. Scenes from this nightmarish period will remain embedded in memory until my final hours. Local party brass repeatedly spoke of the successful defence of the Memoirs line. However, upon reconnaissance, I immediately saw that it was going to fall quite harmlessly into Russian hands, for the only sign of life was a peacefully grazing herd of deer. Even the occupants and workers on the larger estates were hastily assembled in westward treks, for which we could at least provide a small amount of fuel for the tractors. Magnificent herds of cattle were driven from their barns into the fields to await a very uncertain future, and proud Prussian estate homes were within hours left empty and cold to face the oncoming frenzy of barbaric destruction. Russian fighter bombers circled low over the town. However, the people in the street appeared indifferent to them, although some took shelter behind a kiosk or the trunk of a tree. Army units continued to march through town, each one, however, led by an SS officer to supposedly stiffen resistance. For now we were under the command of Himmler, and the commissar system adopted from the Soviets was supposed to save us. However, in fact, it spelled the end of our German army group. Himmler, the head of the SS, was made commander of this particular front during the dying days of the war, something he was hopelessly ill-equipped for, and is believed to have suffered a nervous breakdown before being removed. The Soviet commissar system refers to the use of political soldiers behind regular troops, whose task it was to shoot anyone not doing exactly as ordered with the right amount of enthusiasm. Captain Vanke and I had to attend to divisional matters in the town of Landsberg. When our job was done, Vanke, who said he had friends in town, a veterinary couple, and wanted to find out how they were doing, suggested we look them up. We found the young couple, who welcomed us heartily, and who cheerfully declared that they had that previous evening made the decision to end their lives. They were not going to be driven from their home and possessed the necessary poison to commit suicide. Lucky were those who had the means, because 4 weeks later, dozens of families drowned themselves in the Norgarda Lake, rather than suffer the murder and rape they knew was coming their way. Sometime in early February, we were cut off, and I was certain that the end had come. However, after abandoning our last remaining vehicles, we found a narrow escape route which ran along the railway line towards Frankfurt. That night, under the cover of darkness, we undertook a long forced march which the general, because of his age and weight, found most strenuous. While we stamped our way up and over hills and through pine forests, expecting at any moment to run into a Russian patrol, we suddenly saw long lines of brightly lit empty railway carriages heading west. It was, we discovered, the Reichsbahn rescuing its rolling stock. However, we were puzzled why no one had thought of using these empty trains to evacuate more refugees. Our march continued to the edge of the town of Kustrin, and that night we slept on the floor of a typewriter factory, where every surface was covered in typewriters. In the middle of the night, an employee appeared who attempted to carry as many of these machines as possible over to the west bank of the river. All night long, from a nearby fortress, we could hear the stuttering of submachine fire. Someone said it was the SS liquidating the inmates, but we never found out the truth. The morning brought us another sad encounter. It was an officer of the Lasso army in his Cossack fur hat and bright red riding breeches. I believe he may have been a member of the Lasso division under General Bunyatchenko, which had been deployed for the first time in the Kustrin region. A large number of Russians and Ukrainians fought alongside the Germans, including the Cossacks, many of whom surrendered with their entire families to the British, who cynically turned them over the Soviets with predictable results. On an extraordinarily mild morning, our orders took us to the west of Frankfurt. General Bussers, commander of the Ninth Army, had his HQ at the edge of the town of Fürstenwalde, and we were supposed to set ourselves up in the small Spree River community of Hangelsberg. However, the Russians had already pushed their way forward to the River Oder, and had even established a bridgehead at Kustrin, from which they could no longer be ejected. I don't remember exactly when, but sometime at the end of February I had a telephone call from a former commander of the 192 Reserve Division's regiments in Gnesen. He had been wounded in January and had been sent to a hospital in the city of Dresden. When I asked him how he had survived the bombing, he replied that despite all possible preparations, there had been a heavy loss of life. At the start of the raid, he had dragged himself from his bed into the courtyard, where he lay on the stones all during that first night, preferring to die in the open than be buried under the rubble. I seem to remember it was the 3rd of March 1945, a grey, overcast Sunday, and I and a group of officers belonging to the staff of General Schrock were in the small village of Hangelsberg, just east of Fürstenwalde. While East Prussia, West Prussia and Pomerania were falling victim to a wave of indescribable brutality and mass killings, we 15 or 20 officers, NCOs and drivers had been assigned to the newly formed traffic control unit with the task of trying to smooth the movement of the countless pitiful refugee treks. Towards evening, my thoughts returned to my parents in Wangeritz. Happily, Patricia and the children were out of the danger zone and were now living with the Schwerins in Zettermin. It was on that very same evening that my parents embarked on the 4th flight of their lives. The following is based on the description given by my mother and father after their safe arrival in Witzwort, near the city of Husum, in Schleswig-Holstein, which became the British zone of occupation. My mother recorded her memories of the first 2 days, which took them via Gollnau and Alt Dam, and where they nearly came to grief crossing the River Oder just south of Stettin. She sent her account to Patricia in England, who translated it, and, as far as I can recall, had it published in the National Review in 1948. Weeks before the Russian breakthrough, local authorities continued to strictly forbid all flight preparation and movement to the west. Whereas at first my parents had elected to stay, they decided, however, at the last moment to leave after all, and in a mad rush my father assembled the refugee trek, which included nearly all of the estate workers and the entire village population. A large group of Russian POWs, most of whom had already worked on the estate for over a year, were placed in charge of the fine herd of cattle, which they dutifully drove west, and a few young Russians volunteered to drive the only available tractor. The family home was left as it was, and in later years I often wondered what the Russian invaders might have thought about the big photo on the wall of my father, dressed in his Russian Tsarist uniform. In the darkness of that Saturday night, the trek departed just as the SS were shooting it out with the enemy a couple of kilometres away. The Wangeritz village church was struck by a shell and burned to the ground. The castle was set on fire, and today one can barely see the foundations. My father had wisely selected a favourable route south through the forest estate of Matzdorf. To his left stood the extensive farm buildings belonging to Farmer Lutschewitz, who next morning was put up against a barn door and shot. I could only hope that other members of his family were spared the terrible fate of hundreds of thousands of others. Thus, the long refugee train of tractor and horse and carts of all description approached the Matzdorfer forest and lake, taking the same route we had so often used on our sunny bathing excursions. The tractor suddenly broke down, and since we dared not linger, we left it and the young Russian driver behind, expecting him to wait for his oncoming compatriots. In the area of Alt Dam, the trek encountered further difficulties, and was forced to a halt when suddenly the tractor and its young Russian driver reappeared and overtook the column. With stubborn determination, the young man had located the source of the breakdown, repaired it, and had quickly caught up. Before moving on, they swiftly reattached 2 or 3 wagons to it. A very dangerous section of the journey was the crossing of the Oder Autobahn bridge south of Stettin. A vast traffic jam had developed. The incline was slip-peary with ice, and low-flying enemy airplanes exhausted their ammunition firing into the mass of fleeing people and vehicles. The stupefying collection of gruesome scenes demanded every ounce of mental strength to prevent one going mad. Approximately 24 or 28 hours after leaving Wangeritz, the trek finally made it without loss over the bridge. Expecting at any time to suffer the same fate or worse that had befallen many treks ahead of them as seen from the shattering images of death and destruction to the left and right of the Autobahn, my mother and father nonetheless, despite being numb with horror, possessed the inner fortitude to carry on, and even in later life were able to describe these harrowing scenes with undiminished clarity and without breaking down. Even if the immediate danger had passed, once they crossed the river, the suffering and dying continued, especially among the very young and the very old. My mother ended her tale by describing their arrival at a temporary overnight stop in Prenzlau, north of Berlin, where most treks from Pomerania had gathered. It must have been the 7th or 8th of March when the staff of General Schröck was ordered to the town of Stralsund, and although we had no troops under our immediate command, we understood we now belonged to a newly formed arm of the service within the 9th Army, under the overall command of General Busse, head quartered in Fürstenwalde. Even 38 years later, I clearly recall those few weeks when we stood on the banks of the still untroubled waters of the River Spree, when we walked through the beautiful Prussian forest with its immaculate black and white signs and here and there black and white gates. What was going to happen to this meticulously maintained forest in a week or two? I also thought about the brightly coloured Berlin double-deck buses that used to carry holidaymakers to the river, but now carried troop replacements to the Frankfurt front line just as General Gallieni's Paris taxis of the Marne had done in 1914. On one particular day, following an air raid on Berlin, the daylight sky was so blackened by clouds of smoke and ash that at midday it seemed as if night had fallen. Outside the building's individual soldiers or groups of soldiers lay or sat on their coats or rain-capes either in hopeless silence or in sad song. Those were old German soldier songs, but also some Russian ones too, for among the men were Ukrainians, and Russians many of whom had shared in our agony, had fought with us side by side, and were now scattered among the many fleeing foreign workers from factories on the Weichsel or the Oder. They were the ones who were the most uprooted of all. It should be mentioned that nearly 1 million Russians served with the Wehrmacht. Many were known as Highwise or Hilfswillige, and who upon capture by the Soviets would have faced a severe penalty. Anyway, whoever they were, be it Russian, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Latvian or German, lost or absent from their unit, they were all trying to escape the Asian hordes now descending upon us. One lasting picture of that tiny village was our farewell from our host and hostess, and the lady shopkeeper in the small store, all of whom stood with tears in their eyes as they waved and wished us luck. I was to travel together with an NCO and was given permission to stop in at Zettermin, where Patricia, Mary and 4-month-old Michael had found temporary refuge. The route took us via Rudersdorf, where the carbon works appeared to be still in full operation. The train travelled through Oranienburg at dusk and arrived in Zettermin late that night. After 4.5 years, I was back at Zettermin, but once again, when meeting the local people, just as I had when on leave from Romania, I found only a hard, dull insensitivity and shaded looks that were almost unseeing and uncaring. I was, however, able to shrug off the unpleasantness, knowing that Patricia, Mary, and the little Italian Michael were safe. It had been the end of January when a captain in an anti-aircraft unit had made a stopover in Wangeritz in his Volkswagen Jeep. His driver was Eric, a boy from Wangeritz who had persuaded his boss to drive by his village on the way to the west. The captain was welcomed by my parents, and when during the course of the evening it became known that he was heading across the River Oder into Mecklenburg, my father quickly developed a plan. Producing a bottle of his best wine, and with a promise of gasoline from his private tractor supply, he persuaded the captain to take Patricia and the 2 children with him. So, before dawn the following day, my parents said goodbye to Patricia, the bundled-up Michael, and to Mary and her rather large knapsack. Was this to be the last time they would see each other? My mother made a parting present to Mary of an aquamarine necklace, which had been given to her by her father at the time of her first ball. The flak captain wanted to drop Patricia off just west of the Oder, but Eric persuaded him to deliver her at least to Wolfshagen, the home of Graf Alexander Schwerin, brother of the Zetterminer Graf. Many years later I learned that Wolfshagen had been given to the Schwerins by the Grand Duke in 1648 for services rendered. Following a charming reception in a house already overflowing with refugees, Patricia and the children resumed their journey next day by train. Erich, the driver, was unfortunately killed a week later during an air raid on the city of Leipzig. Leaving Zettermin, we headed north to a spot on the southernmost edge of Stralsund, from where, on the border of the Greif's forest, we had an unobstructed overview of the highway leading in from the east, which allowed us to watch over and guide the endless flow of refugees. Towards the middle of March, one of our guide and orientation posts reported incoming treks from the area around the town of Naugard, and I immediately had it look for the one coming from Wangeritz. Half an hour later it was found, and I saw my parents again. My father, looking thin, pale and dog-tired, was seated on the tractor at the head of the column. My mother described how for days he had been suffering from stomach cramps, yet never lacked in energy and far-sighted wisdom. When asked about Frau von Bismarck, he pointed to the back, and there she was, surrounded by her many bits and pieces, seated in her venerable old Daimler, Benz hitched to the tractor, and beside her was Frau Nielsen, her long-time Swedish masseuse. In response to my greeting, Frau von Bismarck gave me a weak smile. I was now in position to assist my home village trek in the way of accommodation and fuel, along with much-needed mechanical repair to the tractor. Next morning, when saying goodbye, I learned that Frau von Bismarck had decided to part from the trek and head for the home of a senior forester in the Ville Lager of Seckendorf, where the old lady, who had always jealously guarded her food supplies, died of starvation following the arrival of the Russians. Frau von Bismarck was born a Vorwerk, and long before the outbreak of the First World War she had married a Herr von Osten. Their only son died in the war, and much later she married Herr von Bismarck, from whom she was soon divorced, so in reality she was never a true member of the Bismarck clan. While at Stralsund, I was able to telephone Patricia in Zettermin, and there was much discussion as whether she should leave for the west of Germany. The Schwerin family were of the firm opinion that such a move was totally unnecessary, because they simply could not believe that the Americans would allow Mecklenburg to be occupied by the Russians. When asked for my opinion, I gently suggested that Patricia ought to take up Ulla von Bismarck's offer of accommodation near the town of Segeberg. Patricia duly left Zettermin and, in dramatic fashion, finally reached her destination in Damsdorf after barely escaping an air raid on Bad Oldesloe. The rather depressing control work in Stralsund soon came to an end, and General Schrock and his small staff were transferred to Strasbourg just west of Pacewalk, but what we did there I don't recall. The front now ran the length of the River Oder, and with that there were no longer any treks coming out of Pomeranier. However, we were put to work salvaging fuel and essential war material. I do remember lengthy trips to the north and south, once to the heavily forested Region of Altwarp, then Anklam followed by Prenzlau, to an army staff meeting, during which journey I bypassed a POW camp for British officers. On a warm, sunny afternoon, I was sent to Fürstenberg and Grancy, and on another day I spotted a huge smoke cloud in the sky and heard a rumour that a battle cruiser had been set on fire in the port of Swinemünde. Amidst all this, I was stopped by a girl in riding gear in search of overnight accommodation because she was on her way to Segeberg on horseback. By now I knew that Patricia had arrived safely in Damsdorf, so I scribbled a few lines and asked the girl to drop them off when she got there. Patricia told me later of a girl who had come some weeks later to the Damsdorf dairy to deliver the note. During our days in Strasbourg, it appeared to me that the former Gnesen officers were beginning to show strong signs of disagreement. Most knew that I was married to an English woman, but now they began to behave in a very unusual manner. When entering a room in which two officers were talking, for example, I noticed how they both fell silent or resumed their discussion only in whispers. Another detail which remains with me after all these years was the occasion when we were ordered out to celebrate Hitler's birthday on April 20th. I don't know how genuine the demonstrations of loyalty were because our ranks had been richly sprinkled with SS officers. However, the general feeling here too was that the Americans would never abandon Mecklenburg to the Russians. A tall SS lieutenant, who smilingly declared how he had been born in India, was at this time assigned to our staff. It was clear that the shadowy presence of the SS was the result of the entire front north of Berlin being under the command of SS General Felix Steiner, and to ensure that we all fell in line with orders from the Führer's bunker. Hardened as I was by human suffering and the terrible demise of the Prussian world and Eastern Germany, I was frequently overwhelmed by a sense of déperation when faced with the sight of hundreds of men, women, and youth labouring over anti-tank ditches, none of which were ever likely to stop a single tank. It was clear to me that the Americans and the Russians had already drawn up a plan and were not likely to deviate from it in the final hours. We were often required to convince elderly farm folk, many of whom remembered the more civilized conditions of the last war, that the Oder front was unlikely to hold for any length of time and would most probably collapse within hours. Even though the Russian attack on the Oder front already began on the 16th of April, we up in East Mecklenburg suffered no direct consequences until the front was penetrated either side of the city of Stettin, which occurred on the 23rd, following which things moved quickly and we received orders to move back. You can imagine that after a period of 39 years, some memories are likely to be spotty. However, I do recall the deep sadness I felt when seeing how the beautiful trees along the highway had all been cut down to fuel the wood gas-powered vehicles. I also recall seeing Polish and French POWs calmly working their designated fields as if the world were completely at peace. Our little DKW car was heavily laden with not only me, the driver, 2 NCOs and 2 refugee women. From Strasbourg, our route took us first to New Brandenburg, from where I was sent to Treptow to untangle a mass of refugee treks, which was one of the saddest afternoons I have ever experienced. On the one hand, I was in country familiar to me from many army manoeuvres back in 1937, but on the other, I now found myself thrust into the indescribable pain and suffering of both man and beast. Countless foals, at first able to keep up with their mothers in harness, now lay in small heaps beside the road, and the Russian fighter bombers roamed unopposed overhead, shooting up both retreating troop elements as well as unarmed refugee columns. In Güstrow, I remember coming upon a train full of wounded which could go no further, and in which the nurses and medics were preparing a poison potion with which to commit suicide. Somewhere in that area was also a weapons collection point. Their retreating troops were to hand over their weapons and equipment for distribution to some do-or-die special forces. General Schrock viewed the assembly area and, upon returning to us, remarked how he had just witnessed the last hours of the Wehrmacht. It was also in Güstrow, if I remember correctly, where the general came to us on April 30th and reported that the Führer had died in Berlin, a piece of news received by all with complete indifference. On the sunny but cold morning of May 1st, while awaiting further orders outside the town of Rostock, I reflected on what might have become of Captain Biebelger, who had been transferred there. Then we received instructions to organise and guide further treks to the town of Wismar, and, if available, to supply the tractors with fuel. While carrying out these duties, I ran into an army school classmate from my Dresden days, a Captain Kraus, who, upon recognising me, declared in anguish how the war was lost. I hoped afterwards that he hadn't noticed my look of incredulity at this rather childish understatement. The following was an example of how far apart sober-thinking folk were from the fight to the last bullet fanatics. I was tasked with approaching the army bar racks with orders for the garrison to move back, but upon arriving found all doors firmly barred. I was treated with undisguised hostility because it was believed that I was an SS officer with orders to organise the town's defences. Only with great difficulty was I able to convince the officers inside that I was not SS. That evening, I was to report to the town of Schwerin, and during my drive south I got a first-hand look at the enemy's complete control of the air. Although this time it was the Americans, and from then on one of us always stood up in the vehicle to keep a close eye on the sky above, although from the many corpses and destroyed vehicles in the ditch, it would appear that no matter how observant, death could rain down at any time. At the approach to Schwerin, just as we emerged from a wood and reached a straight stretch of road, we encountered another unforgettable scene. In the evening sunlight, a village stood before us, above which a swarm of American fighter bombers were milling around. Suddenly there was a huge explosion, and one of the aircraft came fluttering to earth in a ball of flame, while at the same time a Volkssturmflak battery crew, who had been firing steadily, stopped to do a victory dance. They had hit a bullseye. A bit later we saw what the American planes had been shooting at. They had attacked a column of refugees, and all around lay dead and dying horses, wagons ripped apart with luggage and clothing scattered in all directions, and a general state of chaos. The dead refugees had by then already been removed. Later that evening, I arrived at the assigned estate, but there was no sign of the general and telephone contact was unsuccessful. While there, I ate my daily rations in the kitchen of the estate, along with a number of POWs. I can't remember if they were French or Poles, but they seemed content eating and chatting with the kitchen girls, and I suspected that their life had not been too bad, which I think was generally the case for prisoners working on country estates. Patricia and my parents, who would have been killed had they stayed, were happily safely behind British lines, but what was the fate of the Schwerin family living at Zettermin? Because from my latest telephone conversation with Patricia, I learned that the Graf and his whole family had decided to stay put, no doubt under the mistaken belief that the Americans would never allow the Russians to occupy Mecklenburg. The highly confused situation of scattered troop elements, staff officers without orders and missing generals, suddenly cleared up in the afternoon when orders were received to cross the River Elbe to the west. Our front to the west, or what was left of it, and those still fighting the Russians, had reached an agreement with the English to put down their arms and allow British and Allied units to swiftly move east. We all understood that this would allow the rescue of countless refugees from the clutches of the Russians. Suddenly, there was a small degree of common sense. Those officers still on General Schrock's staff took off immediately. However, I was able to convince the NCOs and men that it would be better if we set off fully armed and stick together in one group in view of possible violent behaviour from released POWs and foreign workers. So off we went, with finger on the trigger, along a country lane only within a few kilometres to come upon an unholy noise from the village ahead. Suddenly a truck was seen coming towards us at breakneck speed and swaying dangerously from side to side. It was overladen with Russians, all of whom were completely drunk. I prepared myself for some unpleasantness when the driver, who must have spotted my group, suddenly lost control of the vehicle, perhaps never having driven before, and crashed it against a tree, scattering his passengers on both sides, like falling apples in the wind. Gathering themselves up, they came to us smiling and laughing, and then tried to get the truck going again. Luckily, there was enough room for our DKW to get by, and we wasted no time in getting away. Using side roads and lanes, we made good progress until we came upon a scene I have already described earlier in this diary. From the edge of a wood, we neared the highway along which, almost as if in peaceful times, a splendid column of anti-tank troops were passing. They kept proper distance, maintained regular speed, and were heading to the northeast. Because there was no gap in the convoy for us to pass through with our DKW, after a short conference, I decided to walk up alone to the intersection and the lone traffic controller, and before I could even open my mouth, he gave me a smart salute to which I responded in kind. I quickly waved to my small group, and moments later we were across the main highway. I often wondered whether the lone soldier had been given orders to allow German troops to pass, or whether he took me in my long grey coat to be a Russian. Wilhelm already described this encounter earlier on in his diary, but it is interesting to note that these Allied troops were Canadian. We proceeded on in the direction of Roggendorf, where upon getting closer it became uncomfortably clear that more POWs and foreign workers had found copious quantities of alcohol and were celebrating their new-found freedom with an infernal row. Since there was no way around the town, it was decided we should split up and each try our luck. With me in the DKW were Sergeant Arnold, who was trying to get to Schleswig-Holstein, the lanky SS officer, and one of the two refugee women from Strasbourg, the other having chosen to remain in Rostock. At the entrance to the village, we encountered French POWs who immediately demanded we give up all weapons, and so I said goodbye to my trusty 9mm pistol, which over the years had given me much peace of mind. With that, the French kindly directed us through the village and out to the other side, allowing us to distance ourselves from the hellish noise of the drunken celebration. It was already dark when we neared Ratzeburg, where our SS officer tried to rid himself of his uniform in a roadside guest house. People there warned us that we could go no further because the English had occupied the town. I decided to circumvent the place to the south, and for a while all went well, but then it was all over. A Canadian anti-tank gun crew spotted us and ordered us over. They brought us into the village of Schmilau, where, having first allowed our refugee women to leave, they left us standing in the street to suffer the tantalizing smell of fried bacon as the Canadians were being fed. A 3/4-ton truck took me then to the town of Moln, the old town of Till Eulenspiegel. Where the others went I can no longer say, but I was interviewed by a German-speaking officer who examined my papers with astonishment upon seeing reference to my English wife. I am not sure what brought it on, but suddenly he cried out angrily, "And you call us capitalist?